The Bible addresses issues such as abortion, marriage, Israel, national debt, and the purpose of government. But why are most pastors silent about these? Welcome to Freedom Alive. 90% of pastors acknowledge that the Bible speaks to the cultural and political issues of the day. But 90% also said they won't speak out on those same issues. Pastor Tim Ginter is one of those pastors who is not silent. In fact, he has served in political office for 8 years while being a pastor. Pastor Ginter is senior pastor of Church at the Center in Salem, Ohio, and he joins us to share how important it is for pastors and the church to actively get involved in the political arena. I'm thankful again to be joined by co-host Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, it is staggering to think that the majority of pastors are not addressing the very issues that are affecting our culture.
Yeah, he was a pastor, has been a pastor already up until now for 43 years. So he wasn't always in the situation where he felt he was called to run for office, but he always spoke on biblical issues. And so he didn't ignore those issues, he says. And you'll hear that from his interview. Amazing process in terms of his calling to be a pastor. And then how did it come about that he felt a call to actually run for office? And not only did he run for office, but he was successful 4 times. He served 8 years in the Ohio legislature, and he worked his way up all the way to the Speaker Pro Tem, which is the head, if you will, of the entire representation on the House side of the Ohio legislature. So he was very involved in the process. Mm-hmm. How did he get from being a pastor to where he then ended up? And he continues to pastor now. So I think it's going to be an amazing story, and hopefully it's encouraging to pastors and to people, because one of the things we talk about is the hunger that people have to be able to have their pastor speak about issues that are relevant in their community and in our nation and in our world.
Exactly. So many of these issues aren't political at all. They're really biblical issues, and we cannot wait to bring this episode to you. But our Freedom Alert is next.
The church must rise up. The Walt Disney Company is at the forefront of culture wars. They aggressively oppose legislation in Florida that would prohibit schools from giving lessons on sexual orientation and gender identity to children in kindergarten through 3rd grade. Disney's decision led to calls for boycotts and an immediate 5% decline in their stock price. But Disney seems fine with losing money as they continue to push this agenda on innocent children. Disney's leadership said in writing that they are more committed to the issues of environmental, social, and governance, LGBTQ, and diversity, equity, and inclusion than they are to money. They told their shareholders they're expecting to sacrifice profit in order to win the culture wars. The church must be more committed to God's truth than Disney is to the lie.
Up next, Matt's interview with Pastor Tim Ginter.
Our special guest on Freedom Alive is Pastor Tim Ginter. He is the pastor at Church at the Center in Salem, Ohio. And not only a pastor, but you've also been very involved in the political process. Welcome to Freedom Alive, Pastor Tim.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here, Matt. I count it a great privilege to be with you, and thank you for the work that you do on behalf of our nation and the causes that are so important, especially at this time in our history.
Well, thank you, and for what you do, too. You've been a pastor for at least, 43 years plus. You've been the pastor at the Church at the Center for at least 12 years, served as a state representative also for 8 years in Ohio, during which you were elected as the Speaker Pro Tem. So you combine this long-standing and still continue pastoral experience and calling with also involvement in the political realm. Let me move the clock back a little bit. Before you actually ran for office, when you served a term eventually of 8 years as a state representative in Ohio, you were pastoring. How is it that you came to the position that God was putting on your heart that you should run for office?
Well, it is a long story that I'll have to compress for the purposes of this interview, but it was a gradual revelation, I would say, that down through the years, I've never been reticent. I have to back up a moment and say, in all of the years of my preaching, I've never been reticent to preach on the subjects that pertain to the life or lifestyle of our congregation and how that interacts with society. And so even as I look at some of my old messages and I review back in the 1980s, I am really astonished to see that even back then I didn't remember that I was as bold as I was in regards to the social issues. However, having said that, it never entered my mind to ever enter politics or to be involved in government. So I had, I guess, bought in to that doctrine, so to speak, or the belief that I had been taught that there was a distinct separation. I had been taught to preach the gospel. I had been trained to preach the gospel, and that was my calling. That was my passion. And I did not even ever consider moving over into the realm of government because of that line. I didn't feel that it was evil. I just felt that that wasn't my place.
Mm-hmm. So how did you come to the point where you started to have a different view, and then you began to start considering that, in fact, you would run for an elected position?
Well, I had some exposure through some I believe, God-ordained events to some individuals in office. And as I began to be exposed to them, especially here in Washington, D.C., on the way home from a visit with one of them who had asked me to come and pray with them, I began to recognize how important it would be for Christians to run for office. And the more I began to go down that pathway, and the more I began to consider others, I even began to name people in my church and my congregation that I was going to recruit to run for office, the more God began to impress upon my heart. I can't call it anything else but a call that was similar to what I felt when I was called to preach. And I received a distinct call to preach. I cannot deny, I couldn't escape it. And in that same way, God began to impress upon me that I was called or being called into the realm of government. Now, I have to hasten to say, Matt, that my natural response and reaction to that was, this can't be of God. And so I began to do some research. I began to build my case, as it were, as to why the feelings that I was beginning to have were not from God. And I began to research the scriptures. I began to read history. And so in a roundabout way, God actually convinced me. The more I read the scriptures, the more I read our history, the more I delved into the past of the United States, the more, instead of reinforcing my argument against the call into government, the more it reinforced the call that God was calling me into government.
That's interesting, because the more you look at the history of our country, you realize that many of those early founders that we think of them as political, they had theological, pastoral backgrounds, and they maintained much of that throughout their political life as well.
Absolutely. You know, I ran into stories such as Frederick Muhlenberg, the Lutheran pastor, who originally was very reticent, much like myself, to enter any type of government activity, but eventually then ran for Congress, was elected, and became Speaker of the House, the first Speaker of the House, a Lutheran pastor, and was one of the two first names to sign our Bill of Rights. Frederick Muhlenberg, a Lutheran pastor, signed along with Vice President John Adams, which I thought is particularly significant in that we're talking about, in this day and age, the separation between church and state. And here we have the co-joined labors of, so to speak, a minister and an attorney. And so those two were the first names on the Bill of Rights. With those type of historical evidences, I began to read the David Barton books and some of those type of books. And again, the Lord just seemed to pull the rug right out from under me. It doesn't mean that I was comfortable with it. It doesn't mean that even those around me were comfortable with it, or even fellow pastors, but I couldn't escape it.
So now you're starting to go down this road, trying to refute what you're feeling, but you're actually finding historical and biblical support for what you're feeling. And there came a day, I'm sure you had to discuss this with others and make a decision to run for office. When you did make that decision, how did your congregation, how did other pastors respond to that when you now have decided, Pastor Tim, your pastor that people have known as a friend in the community, as a colleague, now is going to run for elected position as a state representative in the Ohio legislature?
Well, as you can well imagine, Matt, there was a variety of responses. Our first concern, of course, was our congregation, because that had been, and we felt to be our primary call, and that of the sword, wielding the sword of the Spirit. And now I'm going to take up the sword of government. And so I'm essentially putting the sword in one hand and in the other. And as I went to the congregation about this after much prayer, and I shared with them our story, the journey of my call on a Sunday morning, and what we felt God was calling us to, received a standing ovation. And the congregation, I think there may have been one family that left, but other than that, they left quietly. I mean, they did not cause any issues, but other than that, the church was unanimous in their support of me. They were so kind, and their support was so strong and reassuring that I knew that God was confirming that I was on the right pathway. Now, in regards to other ministers, I received a variety of responses there. There were ministers, even to this day, that can't understand how a pastor called to preach the gospel would also receive a call to become involved in government, in civil government. And so that indeed is probably one of the reasons that we're having this conversation today. Because, but I do see that door opening up. I do see other pastors responding. I'm hearing more and more of pastors also sensing that same move of God in their heart and a call to service in civil government.
So you ran for office. You were elected as a state representative in Ohio. You served for 8 years. Is the term there for state representative 2 years or 4 years? 2 years. So you actually ran for office 4 times and won 4 2-year terms. So you were in that role for quite some time. And not only in that role where you were the state representative, you actually rose through the ranks and became the Speaker Pro Tem of the entire House in the Ohio legislature. So you worked your way into that process intimately while you're still pastoring at the same time.
That is correct. And we continued to pastor. Our church continued to grow. God continued to put his blessing upon that ministry. It was very evident that his grace was upon us. And remember that I was entering into a field, a call, again, much like I did for the ministry, I was entering into a call of which I had not been prepared for. However, I do think that there are some similarities between the church government and civil government. There are many things that I've encountered when I served in civil government that is simply a matter of serving people. The form is different, the protocol is different. Of course, learning the legislative language, learning the process of creating bills, committee hearings, all of those things. There's a steep learning curve there. However, after having gotten into that, I recognize that it is also service. That's why the Bible calls those in government servants. And we recognize even in the King James Version calls them ministers. And in England, they still even refer to them as the prime minister. And so there was much similarity between the call of God to civil government and the church.
So speak to pastors and people in general, frankly, about the intersection between faith and public policy, between pastoral ministry and political ministry as well. Because as you mentioned, prime minister, minister of finance, minister of justice, minister of health. We don't use those terms here in the United States, but those are terms that historically have been used and are still used in Europe and other parliamentary countries.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. And I think they're very accurate. And I think if we go back into the history, I'm sure you agree, if we go back into the history of our nation, there has been this determined effort in the last few decades to separate, as you well know, church and state. And in that separation, There's been also an effort to separate the spiritual foundation, the spiritual aspect, and the principles of the scriptures that have been used as a foundation for our nation. And there's been this very strong effort to secularize the government from the church and the government from any spiritual influence, which we know, as we study our history, is completely false. Unfortunately, many pastors and many churches have bought into that. I do not believe that they do that volitionally. I believe it's somewhat of a creep that has happened. And in their effort to preach the gospel, they have bought into this fact that there is no spiritual foundation. It is indeed, the principles of our nation are indeed built upon spiritual principles. And that which has caused us to survive and actually helped us to survive the years that we have survived have not been the intelligence of man, but really the spiritual principles that were put in place by our founders. And unless those principles are maintained, and unless the spirituality and the ministry aspect of government that was established by God is maintained and in fact reintroduced to a certain level in our nation, I don't believe we will survive as a nation. And so I see no tension between those two. Neither did our forefathers. And I think that's the battle we're fighting today.
Yeah, George Washington and John Adams said something very similar to this, that the twin pillars of our government, of our republic, are religion and morality. And anybody who labors to undermine those twin pillars cannot be considered a patriot. Religion is one of those pillars, and that gives the foundation for a people to be a moral people that respect life, that respect someone's integrity and dignity and their property. And therefore, you don't need a lot of external laws, because that religious under foundation from a Judeo-Christian, particularly a Christian perspective, gives that foundation that makes our republic work. And then the Northwest Ordinance also said, as you well know, religion, knowledge, and morality being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall be forever encouraged. And that was in the Northwest Ordinance, which was designed to govern these new territories as the 13 colonies expanded beyond those borders, that whenever you expanded, what you needed to do is have education. And the education would have to include our Judeo-Christian values and foundation. So why is it, pastors, a lot of times they might say, or some people might say, well, I don't want to get political because I don't want to talk about abortion. Let's just take that for example. I want to talk about abortion. It's too political, and there may be people in my congregation who've had an abortion, and I don't want to put up a barrier or offend people in my congregation. How would you respond to that particular issue? We can take others, but just take abortion as one example.
Well, I think there were three things that I was thinking about that we have to guard against, that we are seeing happen today, and we are in the midst of taking place in particularly in the church in the United States. Number one, limiting the scope of the gospel. Number two, restricting the call of God. And number three, pigeonholing history into a certain segment of our history. But number one, we are limiting the scope of the gospel. We say, well, I'm just called to preach Jesus. Well, we are called to preach Jesus, but we're also called to preach the whole counsel of God. And as we preach the whole counsel of God, that also moves into these realms of morality and of lifestyle. We are not only called to preach good news, we're also called to warn and to equip our people to live as God would have them to live. And that results in having to encounter the subjects that we see literally in our headlines today, literally in the forefront of controversy. We are losing the middle ground, Matt. I believe that pastors are being encroached upon. I do not believe the church has encroached upon the territory of the government. I believe the government has very much encroached upon the territory of the church.
Pastor Tim, when the Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade abortion decision in the Dobbs case on June 24, which was a Friday, 2022, when you go to church that Sunday or that weekend and you're in church and that becomes the big news in the Saturday media, Friday social media and online media, but then you come to church and it's just completely dead silent about that issue. that is an incredible disconnect. It's an opportunity, really, frankly, for the pastor, for the church leaders to really speak into the congregation about that issue. And there's a way to hold up the standard of righteousness with also holding up the standard of forgiveness and grace at the same time.
Yeah. Yes. And emphasizing the fact that we are to present the gospel not in anger. We're not to be vindictive. We are to present the gospel. We're to present the truth, as you just mentioned, with love. But this silence is becoming deafening. And in fact, you know, the famous quote is, silence in the face of evil isn't itself evil. Mm-hmm. And so for us as pastors to remain silent when our congregations, and I'm finding increasing numbers of individuals in the region that I live in, are contacting me that attend other churches and that love their pastor. They love their church. They've been there many years. But this has become so disconcerting to them that they're actually reaching out to me and saying, why won't my pastor speak on these subjects? My family needs to hear it. I need to hear it. And you see, our people need to know where the church stands on these issues. And that's part of the call.
Yeah, I know we work a lot at ministry that I founded called Covenant Journey. We work a lot with young people, Christian college-age students. And I can tell you for a fact that they are hungry for biblical truth and for guidance, and they are hungry for their church and their pastor and their community in their church to be able to address real issues that they're dealing with, whether it's dating, sexuality, abortion, marriage, all different kinds of things that they encounter as a young person. They're really hungry for it. So rather than being intimidated that they don't want to hear that you're going to alienate some people, there is a hunger out there if pastors will speak biblically on this issue. Pastor Tim, you are a breath of fresh air as you combine these faith with policy, pastoral ministry with the ministry in the government realm as well, and our duty as citizens to be involved in the government, because there is no disconnect. What would be your final words of recommendation and encouragement to those who are viewing?
Well, the encouragement, I guess, that I would give in the last few moments would be to remind folks that this is not the first time that we have faced crisis in our nation. We have gone through many difficult times. We are definitely in a war for the soul of America. But back in the 1840s, there was a whole denomination that was begun called the Wesleyan Church, which were pastors that really moved out of the Methodist Church because they were beginning to preach on the evils of slavery. And because of that, the Methodist Church put pressure on them, trying to stop them because they said it was too divisive and it was political. Those pastors should continue to preach that. And I'm sure that pastors today and people today listening to me would say, well, of course you should preach against the evils of slavery, because that is in retrospect we see. But we are in that same situation today. Absolutely. And we need to open our mouths and we need to declare with our mouths. John Hancock said, I would that you not only pray, but that you also act. And we have a responsibility to act in whatever way that God opens the door. But one last thing in these last few moments, I'm reminded there was Solomon Stoddard and Increase Mather back in the 17th century, the early days of our nation. They were actually debating one another because the spiritual life of our nation had fallen to such a point that those that were called covenanted Christians really only composed or comprised a fraction of the population of our nation. It's hard to believe that we were in days that early that they even doubted that Christianity would survive. And they were actually debating with one another and saying that actually we had crossed the Rubicon. There was no coming back. But Mather retorted to Stoddard. He said, the remnant is sufficient for the whole. He said, the remnant is sufficient to redeem the whole if we will just do what God wants us to do. And that's my word of encouragement today. The remnant is sufficient for the whole. If we will listen to the voice of God, not restrict the call of God upon our life, not narrow the reach of the gospel, and continue to declare his word, the remnant is sufficient for the whole, and there is hope for the United States.
Well, that's a good word to end this program on. Thank you, Pastor Tim Ginter, pastor of Church at the Center in Salem, Ohio. And your website is churchatthecenter.org, churchatthecenter.org. And for more information about what pastors and churches can do, we also have information on our website, lc.org/churches. So thank you for encouraging us, and thank you for your calling and your ministry.
Thank you, Matt. Again, thank you for what you're doing and the impact you're having.
Thank you.
God bless.
Matt, I think it's a great point that you made earlier. The fact that where Tim has ended up is not at all where he began on this issue.
No, he always addressed biblical issues, so he didn't shy from them. He says when he looked back at his sermons back in the 1980s, for example, he was very bold on addressing biblical issues, whether it be abortion or something else. But on this issue here, he resisted what was a calling that was coming on his life to actually also run for political office. And he sought to prove that the feelings and the urges and the thinking that he was having is wrong. And what he did in doing research in the Bible and in history is prove exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. And so that calling then became confirmed in him, and he felt as much called to be the pastor of the church as he also was called in that role of his life to run for elected office and to be the representative of his people in the state legislature. And that's an amazing transformation, but it's a man who's willing to seek God for the call that God has on his life rather than to run from that. Even though he was trying to disprove it, he ended up researching, finding out that this was really biblical. And the more you think about it, the more you look at it, many of our founders were pastors. They were ministers. They read Greek and Hebrew and Latin. They were very versed in the Bible. And whether they were a pastor or not, many of them were, they were very steeped in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And they didn't see a disconnect. And I think it's really refreshing with Tim's interview that he does not see, nor should we see, a disconnect between being a pastor and being a minister of government. And we talk about that, about being a minister of finance or a minister of health or the prime minister, because they are servants of the people in the way that the pastor is a shepherd to the people.
Mm-hmm. The quote, the remnant is sufficient for the whole if we will listen to the voice of God. And for those of you watching and for all of us, if we listen to the voice of God. Well, in closing, remember Galatians 5, verse 1, which says it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. So join us here next time where you'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.